Hi, Jens again. Thank you for clicking on the video. So before we start, I want to tell you that this video is split into two parts. The first part is going to be covering how do you create your own opening theory, your own repertoire per se, and then the second part is how you should configure that repertoire, meaning should you put in hundreds of lines or should you only look at IDs and try to go from there. You can find the timestamp for both parts in the description, and probably I'll put it in the comments as well. Without further ado, let's get started. Hey everyone, Jens again, and today I want to talk to you guys about the importance of openings and why they matter a lot, but also don't really matter at all. So without further ado, let's jump right into the video. So right here I've got a board over on Lichess with my win rate on one of my alt accounts. This is solely rapid, and I am a little underrated on this account since I haven't played that many games. So that's why my win rate is extraordinarily high on this account. I am about 2400 at the moment, while on my main account I am 2540 rapid. Why do I have an alt, you might ask? Well, you have an alt such that I can practice different openings and see my stats a lot better instead of just having everything on one account. But I want to note that that difference of what do I come out of the opening with isn't solely on, oh, well, you made it. You know that you made a blunder because of this move and now you are +1. I don't mean that. I more or less mean plans and ideas that help you benefit. Because especially in some like blitz and rapid, when you have a position on the board, let's say I'm just going to go into a very classic Ruy Lopez, and we are just going to go into one of the main lines right here with bishop e7, and I'm just going to click here on Master's database. There's thousands of lines here, right? And a very common line here to be played is d3, quiet variation, b5, bishop b3, d6, and then there is one line with c3, knight f5, bishop c2, c5. And this right here is a very common line, maybe not so much this immediate line, but the plan of playing knight a5, c5 is very common for black. The thing is though, is you might be able to get into this position just like your theory, but the issue is that there are hundreds of moves here. Like black could go bishop b7, bishop b6, black could castle, black could go h6, black could go g6 castles, bishop f8, bishop g7. You can bring the knight back, you can bring the queen to b6, you can play the rook to b8 on bishop b6 and try to play for b5. There are so many ideas. And that right there is what makes opening theory so difficult. Because even for just a simple thing, like we are right here, there's already, after d6, there's already so many different variations. Just for white. Let's say I play c3. Only a couple lines here, but instead of b5, they could have been castled straight away, they could have been played d6, they could have tried to play so many things. Even right here, after bishop e7, obviously there's also the move 94. And there's more lines here. Like, the annoying thing is that there is so much theory to be covered. So then your next question is, well, what should I cover then? Because it's simply inhumanly possible to cover thousands of lines. It is kind of possible, but the amount of time that takes, and for most people, it's just not valid. However, sometimes it's also a great idea to cover shit ton of lines, but in general, you just shouldn't. So let's figure out what we should do. If we're going to cover the same opening once again, as white, you only have to choose one line, and from that one line, you probably only need to know 5 variations. So that's maybe about 100 moves you need to know, which is not a lot. If you want to send black into unknown theory, then you need to practice a lot, because you're going to get positions that are never been explored and pretty difficult. However, if you send black into known theory with your own line, then it's pretty valid. I'm going to play this, which is known as the Scotch Gambit. Now, from the Scotch Gambit, it is a pretty two-sided position, right? It's not something where you're like, okay, well, one person's losing, one person's not losing. And there are still a bunch of lines. Like from here after e5, which is obviously the standard move, there are 3 lines of which d5 is probably going to be played if your opponent knows theory. Bishop b5, knight e4, knight takes d4, bishop d7, bishop c6, bc6, and castles. And this is an interesting position. If I'd look at this, I definitely favor black. But what I'm trying to note to you here is if we're just gonna go here, is you can kind of simplify. Okay, let's say knight f3, knight c6. You're like, okay, d4 kind of has to take. We want to go into the Scotch Gambit. Scotch Gambit, there are simply multiple lines, but the thing is, even if we go just back into the Scotch Gambit, there's only like 10 lines you need to know. You know, there's the d5 line I just showed you, there's knight g4 as a line, there's knight e4 as a line, and in total you're only gonna get about 10 lines. So if you want to make your own theory, you should probably just look at the top 10 moves. And if you are a little lower rated, let's say below 1500, also look at the Lichess database, because in here we also see a bunch of incorrect moves. For example, as you can see here, the move queen e7 is quite frequently played, but queen e7 is a horrendous move. Don't get me wrong here, queen e7 is a terrible move, because after something like just castles, okay, well, if you do nothing, obviously the knight is lost. If you take the pawn, which you can't do because of takes, rook e1, right? So queen e7 is still pretty oftenly played at a worse level per se. If I'm just gonna crop here, we can see the average elo. So the average rating that places is 1600. So you see that you should not just look at the master moves, you should also look at the Lichess database and take a look for some inaccuracies. Maybe you see queen e7, you're like, oh shit, I'm gonna lose the pawn, you play queen e2, and now all of a sudden black's better, right? So there's a couple critical things you need to look at, meaning the Masters database, the Lichess database, and this way very easily you can just make an opening repertoire that is really sound. So again, it's just like, take a look at your games, take a look at how much of them you won, and take a look why you won them. Was it very easy to calculate because the position was closed, or very hard? Or were there a lot of trades and a lot of pieces on the board? Or did you find a way to gain advantage in the end game because there was barely anything left? Which means that you don't like complexity, but you like simpleness, and then you can evolve from that. So try to figure out those key points first, and from there you want to build your opening repertoire. Without further ado, I'm going to be showing one more game, why opening IDs are so important. And I think I'm just gonna show this one right here. We're just gonna go right in tune of what we're looking at, which was this Najdorf Sicilian with the Zagreb G3 variation, e5, knight d2, bishop e7, bishop e2, knight c6. Now, I'm just gonna take a look at the move times as well. Both me and my opponent were playing absolutely instantly up until move 10. Or move 12, basically. So he probably was in his theory, so was I. Castles, h3, b5, bishop e3, white. And at this point, I have 0 lines. I don't know anything after this position. I don't have any theoretical lines in my head where I'm like, okay, if b5, h3 is the best move. Bishop e7, I should play bishop e3. I don't know that. I only know IDs here. I know h3 and bishop e3 is a good way to develop my bishop. I know that g4 and knight g3 is a good way to create some type of attack, maybe knight f5, but also defend my pawn on e4. I know that if b4 happens, I put my knight on d5, and I'm not scared of this trade because that is better for me. After that, I can play a3 and always instigate that pawn. If he tries to play knight a5, b3 is fine, because once again, I can play something like queen d3 or a3, because this knight is nicely defended. So these are IDs, these are not lines, these are IDs, and these IDs help me have a good time in this position. So I just think, okay, I gotta develop my bishop, so I'm gonna go h3, bishop e3. He develops his bishop, and I'm gonna continue with another idea, which is g4. He goes knight f5 here, and once again, okay, he's trying to place his knight here, so b3 is a very natural move, but still, it's just one of those moves. You kind of have to know if he wants to go for this. You just go b3. You are not scared of the c-file pressure, which some might be. Some might even opt for something crazy here. I mean, I don't want to go bishop c1. I don't want to say bishop c1. I guess b3 here is the most natural move, but sometimes people are like, too much pressure. Now you're like, okay, b3 makes sense. b3. b4 for my opponent here. Now, I know that if someone plays b4 in this position, that is good for me because this pawn right here is a little bit weak, and I can kind of instigate it with a3 and create a queenside majority. Right, this 2-on-1, and also have a lot of pressure here. But I now have a different position because now knight e5 has been played, so the position is a little bit different, but the idea still holds. So I'm gonna go knight e5, we trade off, and this pawn is still just a little weak. Sure, there's could be pressure on the c-file. Rook b8 is not really a move I think that makes sense at all. I guess it has a slight idea of this and this, but that's quite deep. At this point I'm like, okay, well, what do I do? c4 doesn't really make a lot of sense. Why does c4 not make sense? Because we are just going into a position where I don't really have much here on the c-file. Like, this is a weak extended pawn. Why would I trade that for one of my good pawns? So I'm just gonna go knight g3, continue with a plan. I'm like, okay, maybe knight f5, go after the bishop, just try to be active with my pieces, right? Because the knight on e2 isn't really doing much. On top, it doesn't really else have anywhere to go. But once again, if we didn't go ahead and play g4 right here, where is this knight gonna go? If you have like some, I don't know, let's just say h2, just a random move, and we kind of have a similar-esque position, like so. Now, I mean, this knight is absolutely horrendous, right? It has practically nowhere to go. So by knowing IDs, like, okay, I can develop my knight this way, I find a way to get a nice active position, right? So in here, we're in queen d2, just lining up, rook b5, a3, simple move, takes, rook takes a3, threatening c4, knight b7, because if he, for example, h6, c4, and the rook has to stay guarding the knight, so that would not be a good move. Knight b7 moves, knight f5, I go into the bishop, knight to c5, I play b4, I move out to d7, and c4, and my opponent resigns. You might ask yourself, why the hell did he resign? The position is equal, material-wise. Yes, it is, but my space edge here is overwhelming. I can pick up this pawn, and probably I wouldn't trade my knight here because my knight is super strong. This bishop's not really going anywhere. Take the pawn. I'm threatening c5, which would have two central pass pawns. I can bring the rook over, my bishop's defended, and after something like c5, these pawns would be unstoppable. So yeah, that's why he was like, okay, you know what, I'm done, which, fine. But what is the takeaway from this game is that IDs matter more than openings at lower level. But if you are just looking at straight theory, you can also get a lot of interesting edges. For example, I'm going to show you a liner in Dreux. Just bring open the book as well. On the Masters database, castles, knight d4, d4, knight d6. So many lines here, but here I have 50 lines of theory in my head after move bishop g5. Now, why do I have lines of theory here and not IDs? Because this is a very sharp position. There is a lot of complicated things going on. f6, d5, knight b5, ef6, gf6, rook e1, king f7, and I'm down a complete piece, but it's fine. And that right there is really cool. What I'm just trying to tell you is that when positions are difficult for your understanding, so for example, if you like open positions and they're completely closed, that right there is where you should know theory. So you should practice lines and remember them. And if the position is very much in your flow of play, like for example the G3 Zagreb variation is for me, then knowing IDs is just enough. And this way you can learn openings a lot more quickly. So if you're lower rated, try to figure out what suits you by looking at your games and going from there, at looking at openings that kind of go similar hand in hand to that style, and just figure out IDs on those openings. That way you can get a solid repertoire without having to spend hundreds of hours learning every single move. Okay, now that's all I want to cover for today. Simply figure out your style and learn theory, or learn the right theory and learn the right IDs from there, because everyone has a different style and everyone plays differently.